Hey everyone, welcome to our topic today, which is transmission basics. I'm really excited to have Fritz Kahrl join us. He is an affiliate of Berkeley Lab, and he's a lecturer at UC Berkeley's Goldman School of Public Policy. His experience is really all over the map: electricity markets, transmission, cost allocation, interconnection, resource planning, reliability, rate making, and economics. So we're really lucky to have him. You can enter your questions and comments at any time in the chat box or raise your hand, and we'll be happy to get your question live, and we can call on you to unmute yourself. So this is one of a series of webinars. We have a whole bunch of good topics coming up. Next up is rate design with Pete Kappers on February 24th. That'll be a really good one. We have Grace Relf, who used to be at the Hawaii Public Utility Commission, talking about some fundamentals with respect to power system regulation and market structure. Then on March 24, we have Cody Davis, a former distribution planner and engineer at Ameren, talking about how distribution system operations work and how does that fit into some of the work that you may be doing. And then we're going to have a session on electricity markets, which we also have not covered before. I think that'll be a great one. That's the energy markets, capacity markets, and so on. And how do you know whether they're working or not? And how do those markets affect your rates? We also have some other webinars. One we just scheduled actually, which will be on April 21 on distribution operations and tariff provisions with respect to distributed resources. And then we'll have one on stakeholder engagement with peer sharing breakouts. All right, Fritz.
Thank you, Lisa. It's great to be with you all. I have about 40 minutes of content, and we have an hour and a half scheduled. One sec while I bring my slides up. So that means that we have a lot of time for Q&A. So what I'm going to do, it looks like we're a relatively small group. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through, I have several sections. I'm going to go through section by section. At the end of each section, I'll stop and take questions. And as Lisa said, it's up to you all how you want to do questions. You can put them in the chat. I'll try to keep monitoring the chat. But you can put them in the chat or raise your hand, and we can kind of just be flexible. But I'd highly encourage you to ask questions. I think that'll also help me figure out how to best steer the presentation. So I've got 4 sections that I'm going to cover. First, I'm going to give a little bit of background on transmission actors, functions, types, and the regulatory framework governing certain aspects of transmission. I'm going to talk a little bit about why we build transmission, and we'll focus on transmission reliability, economics, and public policy. We'll talk about how transmission gets built, the different processes through which transmission gets selected and approved. And then we'll talk about who pays. We'll spend a little bit more time talking about who pays for transmission. Often the sticking point in getting transmission built is figuring out the cost allocation. So we'll spend a little bit more time there. So background, let's start kind of with the basics. So what actually is the transmission system? In kind of colloquial conversation, we tend to delineate the transmission in terms of voltage. So this figure from the North American Electric Reliability Corporation kind of gives the standard definition of what's the transmission, what's the distribution system, what's the sub-transmission. You can think of the sub-transmission as kind of between the distribution system and the transmission system. And from this definition, we've got the cutoff line between the transmission system and the distribution system being 138 kV. NERC has a sub-transmission system at 26 kV and 69 kV. And there's a bunch of other voltages in between this that they're not showing. And then the distribution system will be these lower voltages between 13 kV, kind of below 13 kV. So these are not the numbers that I normally use. So to me, 35 kV is kind of the cutoff between the distribution and the sub-transmission system. 138 kV right here is more sub-transmission system, and anything in the kind of the 160 kV and above is the transmission system. But this is kind of an important point, is that there are different ways of thinking about where the transmission system begins and the distribution system ends. In California, for instance, and these definitions can vary quite a bit across different electricity systems and across different states. So in California, for instance, the three investor-owned utilities have themselves different definitions of where the distribution system ends and the transmission system begins. So why does it matter? There's kind of three main reasons why it matters. The first is regulatory. So tend to think of FERC as being as overseeing the transmission system and state PUCs as having jurisdiction over the distribution system. So kind of where you draw the line really matters for jurisdiction. The second is operations. So as we'll talk about in a second, a lot of transmission owners have given their transmission systems to be operated by independent system operators. So which facilities is that? And then the third is cost allocation. So it tends to be more common to have transmission costs shared among different utilities, regions, states, where it is not common it's less common to have sharing of the distribution system. But I want you to start to kind of recognize that even something that seems really obvious, like what is the transmission system, has a lot of ambiguity. To deal with this ambiguity in a regulatory context, FERC uses something called the seven-factor test, and this is, how do we tell on a case-by-case basis for a very specific facility, how do we tell if it's distribution or transmission? So FERC's been using this seven-factor test since 1996, but interestingly, the seven-factor test doesn't use voltage at all. And I just happen to have them up on my screen for something else, but if there's interest, I can dive a little bit more into that in a second. So who plans, owns, and operates the transmission system? Turns out this is a little bit complicated as well. In ISO, in regions with an independent system operator, so we have 7 of those. In those regions, most of the transmission planning and all of the transmission system operations will be done by the independent system operator. But the ISOs don't own any transmission, and kind of as a result, a lot of the local transmission planning will also be done by transmission owners as well. So you'll have these, and a lot of times you'll either have these parallel processes where transmission utilities are still doing a lot of transmission planning alongside the ISO, or they're kind of doing it within the context of the ISO's transmission plan. In non-ISO regions, so on this map, that's going to be the most of the West, except for California and the Southeast. In these non-ISO regions, it's more common to have a single utility that will be the transmission planner, transmission owner, and the transmission operator, kind of all in one thing. The other term that you'll see a lot and that I'll use throughout the presentation today is a transmission provider. So FERC defines this as a public utility that owns, operates, or controls facilities used in the transmission of electric energy. But you can think in more simple terms as a transmission provider is the entity that's kind of operating the transmission system and providing transmission service. This term is also can be a little bit ambiguous as well. I'm going to throw around these terms, planner, owner, operator, and especially transmission provider around a lot. But I want you to kind of appreciate that there's no very solid definition of these terms. And so which organization they're referred to is going to be context specific. So it's never a stupid question to ask, who's actually doing the planning, who's the owner, who's the operator, what does a transmission provider mean in this context? It's there's probably a question that's come into your head at some point, which is this is the transmission system. FERC oversees the transmission system, and so it seems like we should have some pretty standard definitions of what things are and kind of who's doing what. But we don't. We have this kind of hybrid system where we have a central system we have these central system operators, those are the ISOs. But at the same time, we have a lot of the system feels very bottom up. And there's a historical reason for that. The dates back to the 1990s. In the 1990s, the thinking at the time was, well, we're going to move to these regional electricity markets. And the vision was to have kind of 4 big electricity markets throughout the US. But in the early 2000s, after the California electricity crisis, there was a lot less interest in, or there was kind of a pullback of a lot of the move to electricity markets. And so as a result, we're kind of in this halfway space where we have some regional independent system operators that kind of plan for the transmission system and operate the transmission on a regional basis. But at the same time, um, a lot of the terminology and a lot of the specifics are very much bottom up. So you'll kind of feel this tension between these two things as we go through the presentation today. Um, as we talk through transmission, we're going to talk about three main transmission types: local transmission, regional transmission, and interregional transmission. So local transmission will be lower voltage transmission that's exclusively within a transmission service territory, owner service territory. So this will sometimes, but not always, be the case that this will be the definition for local transmission. Regional transmission is often, but again, not always, transmission between transmission owners, and interregional transmission will be transmission between transmission providers. So in each of the different regions of the US, these terms are used kind of differently. And so we're going to walk through a couple of examples that will help to provide some grounding on what these terms mean. The first example is PacifiCorp. So PacifiCorp is a multi-state vertically integrated utility in the Western US. The service territory is in the blue here. And so for PacifiCorp, local transmission means transmission that's within the PacifiCorp service territory. And PacifiCorp has a local transmission planning process that kind of builds out this transmission system. Regional transmission for PacifiCorp will be transmission between PacifiCorp system and other utilities in the West. So PacifiCorp has this energy gateway project that it's been kind of planning for the better part of the last decade. But this project would be a collaboration between PacifiCorp and other utilities in the West. Regional transmission for PacifiCorp will also be transmission that happens through what an entity called Northern Grid. We'll talk about them in a second. They're the regional transmission planner for the Northwest US. And then interregional transmission for PacifiCorp will be transmission that's between the Northern Grid region and other regions. So for instance, between Northern Grid and California. In California, these terms mean something quite different. So California has an independent system operator, the California Independent System Operator, or CAISO, that oversees the entire transmission system for this, or most of the transmission system for the state and a small part of Nevada. And so these terms mean something different in California. Lower voltage transmission will be transmission that's below the threshold for kind of distribution transmission for most of the main transmission owners. So that's tends to be kind of in the 200 kV, less than 200 kV range, at least nominally. Regional transmission will be transmission between CAISO and other transmission providers in the region. And then interregional transmission will be also transmission between CAISO and other transmission providers in the region. As we'll see in a second, the regional transmission, or so let me come back, sorry. Regional transmission will be any transmission that's operated by the CAISO. So regional transmission in California will include transmission that's operated by PG&E, that's owned by PG&E, Southern California Edison, San Diego Gas and Electric, all of the transmission owners. So in many ways, California has kind of regionalized its transmission system through the CAISO. And then for the CAISO, interregional transmission will be transmission between CAISO and other transmission providers. The third example is MISO. So MISO is the Mid-Continent Independent System Operator, and they operate the transmission system across the the middle of the U.S. MISO is clearly a different animal. MISO has, I think, 15 different states participating in it. Maybe somewhere between 10 and 15 states participating in it. It extends all the way from Wisconsin down to Louisiana. Just much more complicated than both California and PacifiCorp. In MISO, local transmission typically means will be transmission that's within a transmission owner service territory. Regional transmission will be the MISO transmission for the MISO system, and then interregional transmission will be transmission between MISO and neighboring transmission providers. So between MISO and SPP, or between MISO and PJM. And then the last example is Order 1000 transmission planning regions. So we'll talk about what Order 1000 is in a second in these transmission planning regions. Um, but Order 1000 required utilities, transmission owners to participate in a regional transmission planning processes. The ISOs kind of already had these, but for a lot of the western and southeastern US, there was no regional transmission, or was no kind of formal regional transmission planning process. So Order 1000 required these, and this just gives you a much better visual of how what region looks like in this context. So transmission planning that happens within the kind of the Northwest region is covered by Northern Grid, Southwest region is covered by West Connect, and then interregional transmission will be transmission between these two regions. So this is kind of complicated, but what I want you to take away is that these different people will use these terms a lot: local transmission, regional transmission, interregional transmission, but what they mean is very, very context specific. Last thing I wanted to cover in background is the regulatory framework. So as you can imagine, there's a very extensive regulatory framework governing transmission. But the ones I want to focus on are kind of four. The open access, open planning, regional planning, and long-term planning. So open access dates back to the 1990s, and it requires transmission providers to provide non-discriminatory access for all customers. So for instance, in the case of PacifiCorp also has several municipal utilities and rural cooperatives kind of within its service territory. And PacifiCorp has to provide transmission service to these customers on the same basis that it does its own customers. So that's open access. In a transmission planning context, open access has some pretty important implications. It means that PacifiCorp also has to plan for the transmission system in a non-discriminatory basis. It has to plan to provide the same access that it would for its transmission customers. So, for instance, the municipal utilities, rural cooperatives, that it does for its own generation and loads. There's two aspects to open access. One is the aspect I just talked about. The other is interconnection. So orders 2003 and 2023 required transmission providers to provide open access interconnection to the transmission system. So what that means is that any generator connecting to the transmission system, regardless of whether it's a utility's own or contracted generator or a wholesale generator, has to be provided the same kind of interconnection service. Second aspect is open planning. This is in Order 890, and this was in the kind of the mid 2000s. And at the time, FERC realized that a lot of transmission providers had different planning processes, and so in a lot of cases, not very transparent planning processes. And so what this did was to require transmission providers to design and conduct an open transmission planning process. So it doesn't mean that FERC approves each kind of iteration of the planning process. All FERC is approving is the design of the process and making sure that it's open and inclusive. The third aspect of the regulatory framework is regional planning. And this was in Order 1000 in the early 2010s. And this requires, as we talked about just a second ago, this requires all transmission owners to participate in a regional planning process that has cost allocation. It also set limits on the right of first refusal. And so at the time, a lot of states gave utilities kind of the first dibs on any transmission that was developed through transmission planning processes. And what Order 1000 did, at least for kind of regional transmission planning processes, was to say these processes have to be limited and ideally competitive. The last element of this framework is more recent. This is Order 1920, which is in 2024. And this requires standardized long-term transmission planning. The idea here was that at the time, there was kind of there were a lot of different approaches to how transmission providers were doing long-term transmission planning. And so FERC decided that it was important to try to standardize long-term transmission planning a bit. So with some elements that were quite prescriptive, and some that gave a little bit more flexibility. So, for instance, the prescriptive part requires transmission providers to use a 20-year planning horizon, and to do a scenario analysis with at least 3 scenarios. So there are some relatively prescriptive parts to this. We're going to mention these terms: open access, open planning, regional planning, and long-term planning quite a bit as we go through. So I just wanted to see them, and I also want you to be aware that there are other elements of the regulatory framework governing kind of transmission planning and transmission cost allocation. These are the core ones. Let me quickly look at the chat and see.
There are no questions yet.
Okay.
Anybody want to raise their hand or
Any
ask
questions?
a question now? All right, we've got Arnell.
Yeah, hey, thanks, Dr. Kahrl.
Fritz.
Question for you. Yeah, Fritz, thanks. Question for you. Just going through the presentation that you walked through, I'm finding it a little bit difficult on my end to wrap my head around, each of the organizations and the parties and what they're responsible for and whatnot. So I'm just wondering if you might be able to perhaps walk through one of the territories and just like point out, each of the parties and what they're doing, and how they have to adhere to each of these different regulations.
Yeah, great question. So let's go through 2 examples. Let's go through California and MISO. Actually, let's go through 3. So in PacifiCorp is a utility. Within PacifiCorp, you might have PacifiCorp has this kind of extensive transmission system. So within PacifiCorp, you might have some other utilities that require PacifiCorp's transmission system to be able to move power around. So that makes PacifiCorp a transmission provider for this entire region. So PacifiCorp is a utility. It has its own generation, has its own kind of loads, but it's also providing transmission service to other utilities. And then PacifiCorp also operates in like the larger region. So there are other utilities kind of around this area. Idaho Power is right here. NVE is, I don't remember what NVE stands for. NVE Energy, I think they lost the acronym at some point, is over here. Arizona Public Service is over here. So there's all kinds of other utilities in this region. And so PacifiCorp has to decide, do we build transmission to these other regions, with these other regions to help deliver resources across states, or do we just focus on our system? FERC is the regulator for kind of the transmission level questions that for PacifiCorp. So FERC will, if PacifiCorp wants to change the terms that it's offering transmission service under, it has to submit kind of a change to FERC, and FERC has to approve it. But on the kind of the retail side of PacifiCorp's business, everything will be state regulated. It's kind of complicated for PacifiCorp because it operates in so many states. But on the retail side, it'll be state regulated. So just keep in mind, wholesale side will be FERC regulated, retail side will be state regulated. And there's a lot of kind of gray area. So that's PacifiCorp.
Fritz, if I could,
yeah.
If you don't mind me asking a follow-up there.
Go ahead.
So
yeah.
On a previous slide, I think you saw the 4 corner states there, each are their own like Southwest territory, I believe.
Yes.
And so
this one.
Or perhaps it may be earlier. I'm sorry.
This one. Yes,
this one right here. So each of that Southwest label is in those 4 states. What role does that entity play, and perhaps how does it affect PacifiCorp in this case?
Okay, great question. There is no entity here. The entity that's in the Southwest, these are just, this is a FERC figure, and these are not like anything. So for the ISOs, this is kind of ISO territory, but in this figure, the Northwest, the Southwest, and the Southeast are not, these are kind of loose planning regions, but they're not an entity. This one has the entity. And the entity here is an actual organization. So West Connect is like a real organization. So they're a regional transmission planner. Northern Grid, also a regional transmission planner. CERTIP in the Southeast, also regional transmission planner. So the regional transmission planners you can think of as sort of like platforms that all of the utilities in the region used to use voluntarily, but now are required to use to do regional transmission planning. But there is no kind of entity governing, no either kind of a regulatory entity or a planning organization or an operating organization in the Southwest. So this will be individual or kind of, and I'm going to take this back in a second, but operationally, this will be individual utilities kind of doing their own thing. What's a little bit different though now is that the CalISO operates its energy imbalance market across a lot of the west and southwest. And so there is something that's not being shown here, which is that energy imbalance market. So in some ways, CalISO is more of does play a role in system operations throughout the West.
Fritz,
Does that
we
help?
also have a question from Annika. Annika, do you want to ask your question?
Oh, yeah, if you're ready.
I'm ready.
Okay. Yeah, I was just wondering if you could, I'm not sure if you're getting to this point, so maybe it's a bit premature, but I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how local transmission planning sort of flows up into or not into the regional transmission planning process.
Yes, great question. And the answer that I told you I would give, I'm going to give, which is that it really depends. So first example, California. So local transmission in California will be kind of the local stuff that the utilities are doing, that's not within the remit of the CalISO. Um, Most of this is transmission that doesn't create new capacity. So for California, most transmission will be managed by the California Independent System Operator. Contrast with MISO. In MISO, a lot of local transmission is transmission planning by lower voltage transmission planning by transmission owners. So for instance, in Minnesota, within kind of the northern part of the MISO system, there's a utility called Northern States Power. It's part of Excel. And they'll do their own kind of local transmission planning for reliability purposes, and that will flow into the MISO's MISO transmission expansion plan. In that plan, MISO is going to like review the transmission that's been proposed by Northern States Power and kind of give it the thumbs up or the thumbs down. It's going to validate it. And then if it's validated and approved, that will be included in the package of transmission in the MISO transmission expansion plan. But how this works, how the local transmission flows up into kind of the regional transmission expansion plans, whether the ISOs are looking at it and saying, okay, this fits or it doesn't fit, or we're just going to rubber stamp it. All of this kind of depends on the region.
Okay, yeah, thank you. So wait, I'm sorry, maybe I misinterpreted what you're saying. So are you saying MISO like approves or doesn't approve the local reliability projects, or it depends whether or not they include it in their
Um,
expansion plan?
you could say that they approve. I think the word they use is validate rather than approve, but you could say yes, they approve them.
Okay. So in other words, you could have local transmission projects that a utility is building, and I guess what I'm trying to like sort of visualize is like if you have a utility building local reliability projects in its service territory, and potentially MISO could identify maybe like a larger regional project that might
Mm.
negate the need for that local transmission project, but the utility sort of builds that local project anyway, and then maybe the cost benefit analysis doesn't pan out for the larger regional project. I guess I'm trying to like tease out whether that's like a conversation that happens between utilities and RTOs or not.
Yes, great question. And so the question is kind of what's this relationship between local transmission and regional transmission? Is the regional transmission provider looking at opportunities to kind of right size local transmission? In MISO's case, the answer is at least nominally yes. MISO is meant to be reviewing the local transmission plans and seeing like, well, if we were to build this kind of regional line, would it offset the need for building more cost effectively offset the need for building local transmission? I think whether and the extent to which that happens varies quite a bit. But in principle, in for some transmission providers, so for instance, in MISO's case, the answer is yes.
And then I'm so sorry. Wait, and I guess maybe the follow-on question that maybe this is like a bigger conversation that we don't have right now. But if like we as regulators, as like people working at public utility commissions are interested in seeing our utilities like try to make that happen, like if we're interested in promoting right sizing, like what can states do to make that happen?
That is an awesome question. And it's also a really complicated one. So to, I think the easy answer is that if there's more participation by states in regional transmission planning processes and sort of more active participation, then it's possible to kind of push this topic a little bit more and maybe get develop a little bit more momentum on kind of being specific about the trade-offs between higher voltage regional and lower voltage local transmission. The trick with this is that a lot of the need for regional transmission is going to be driven by resources that are kind of cross-state. And so there's this very old conflict between kind of seeing the resource and load part of this through the lens of states and seeing it more from a regional perspective. And I think for a lot of states, that's a really difficult trade-off to make. So, and I guess a way of summarizing that would be that regional transmission is driven in a lot of cases by kind of a regionalization of resources in particular. So that means kind of going back, and we'll talk about this in a bit, but going back to kind of the resource planning side of this and seeing, are there opportunities for being more reliant on regional markets and being more reliant on regional resources?
Great, thank you.
Okay, let's keep moving. So this may seem like an obvious question, but there's also some ambiguity in this one. Why do we build transmission? From a regulatory perspective, there's kind of three main reasons why we build transmission. The first is reliability, and that one is at least very well defined. It's to meet North American Electric Reliability Corporation, or NERC, standards for reliability. And there's a very specific document that governs this. It's called TPL, Transmission System Planning Performance Requirement. So if you end up doing work on transmission, I would highly recommend slogging through this document. It provides a lot of clarity on how transmission providers think about reliability in their transmission planning processes. The second driver of transmission is economic efficiency, and this is usually called economic transmission or market efficiency transmission. And it can be defined, we'll talk about this in a second, can be defined kind of more broadly or more narrowly. The third is meeting public policy goals, and this one is a little bit hard to wrap your head around. We'll also talk about this in a second. These are the big three. There are other drivers of transmission, maintaining reliable operations during extreme weather, improving competition for the larger transmission system, facilitating reserve sharing, national security. There's a bunch of other potential drivers of transmission that we're not going to focus on. We're going to focus on these three. I'm going to go through them one at a time. So for reliability transmission, the idea is that we need to maintain reliable operations of the transmission system within three main limits. The first of these is thermal, and that's just the rated capacity of the transmission equipment. So you can think about this in megawatt terms. If we have a 500 megawatt transmission line, we'll need to keep the amount of power flowing in that line below 500 megawatts. Second is voltage. These are voltage limits that are set by a system operator. So we need to make sure that the system is being operated within these limits. Third one is stability, and this stability in this case is the ability of the system to recover from a disturbance. So if we lose a generator or we lose a transmission line, can the system kind of recover to normal operations after an outage? NERC in transmission planning, NERC requires transmission providers to figure out whether their transmission systems are going to be able to kind of operate within these limits during both normal and contingency conditions. And we're going to use the word contingency quite a bit. So let me define what it is. So usually contingency will be a generator or a transmission outage. In transmission planning, we're going to be really interested in transmission outages. So you can think about this in the figure over here. This would be normal operating conditions. So if we lose a transmission line, so the dotted yellow line here is kind of losing a transmission line. If we lose a transmission line, it's going to totally change how the power flows in the system. So once we lose the line and power flow changes, are we still going to be able to meet load under these conditions? And so these will be called contingency conditions. Because the power flow changes once a line goes out, or in some cases once a generator goes out, we have to use power flow models to try to figure out, okay, if we lose this line or we lose these generators, are we still going to be able to maintain reliable operations? And so a lot of transmission planning is dedicated to this question. So we take transmission lines out kind of one at a time or sometimes in tandem and see, is the transmission system going to be able to operate reliability? A lot of the transmission that's built to resolve these types of problems. So these are normally these violations in these three limits are usually referred to as reliability violations. So the solutions to reliability violations that come up in transmission planning are usually not subject to benefit cost analysis. So the idea is we do our transmission planning process, find out there are some reliability violations. We consider several different solutions to those violations. We pick a solution, but we're not going to say, okay, what's the benefit in terms of increased reliability versus the cost of that transmission solution. Usually these are just, we're going to make sure that we're meeting NERC reliability standards, and we're going to find the least cost approach to doing so. Economic transmission is a bit different. And the idea with economic transmission is that we're building transmission to reduce the costs of either building new generation or operating the transmission system. Usually, economic transmission is more narrowly defined in terms of congestion mitigation. So the idea with congestion is that we have lower cost power in different regions of the transmission system, but when transmission lines are congested, we can't deliver power from one part of the transmission to another part of the transmission due to these transmission constraints. Congestion imposes real costs and leads to price separation. So you can think about the costs mostly in terms of fuel costs. So if we have more expensive generation in one region and we have transmission constraints, we may need to increase fuel costs due to the transmission constraints. There's this idea that, well, why don't we just build out the transmission system so we don't have any congestion? But some amount of congestion will always be economic. It may be that we only have congestion in a few hours and the costs are not that high. And so it wouldn't make sense to build any transmission. Congestion is a little bit of a slippery concept, so I wanted to walk through an example to give you a sense of what it is. We're going to define congestion cost as the difference between a least cost dispatch without transmission constraints and a least cost dispatch with congestion constraints. The idea is if our congestion costs are high enough where they're higher than the cost of building new transmission, it may be cost effective to build new transmission to reduce our congestion costs. So let's walk through this example. We've got two zones. We've got zone A and zone B. We've got 1,000 megawatts of generation in zone A that costs $10 a megawatt hour. We've got 500 megawatts of load in zone A. We've got 1,000 megawatts of generation in zone B, costs $50 a megawatt hour. We've got 1,000 megawatts of load in zone B. So this is pretty typical, example for these sorts of things. We've got cheap generation in one zone, not much load. We've got expensive generation in another zone with a lot of load. Okay, so the total load in the system is going to be the 1,000 megawatts plus the 500 megawatts, so 1,500 megawatts total. If we were to totally ignore transmission constraints and dispatch the system, we'd take the 1,000 megawatts of generation from here, from zone A, because it's cheaper, and then we'd have to dispatch an additional 500 megawatts of generation in zone B, more expensive. So our total cost of dispatching the system is going to be 1,000 megawatts times, sorry, there should be a dollar sign here, times $10 per megawatt hour, plus 500 megawatts times $50 per megawatt hour. So that's going to give us a dispatch cost of $35,000 per hour. We're only looking at 1 hour. When we add in our 300 megawatts of transmission constraints, all of a sudden we can't dispatch this 1,000 megawatts anymore. The most we can dispatch in zone A is 500 megawatts plus our 300 megawatts of exports to zone B. So it's going to be 800 megawatts total of generation that we can dispatch in zone A. In zone B, well, we're going to have to dispatch the rest. So remember, we have 1,500 megawatts of load. So we've got 800 megawatts in zone A. We'll need 700 megawatts in zone B. So in this case, our cost is going to be 800 megawatts times $10 a megawatt hour plus 700 megawatts times $50 a megawatt hour. So a total of $43,000 per hour. So notice that our costs have gone up because we have to dispatch more generation in zone B due to transmission constraints. So in this example, our congestion costs are going to be $8,000 per hour. So you can think about this as the max. If we were to build new transmission, this is the maximum amount, at least in this hour, that we could save in congestion costs. This would be our maximum congestion cost savings from building new transmission. In reality, when we build new transmission, we're not probably going to be able to get our maximum congestion cost savings. And so the way that transmission providers usually approach this is they'll start with kind of the base system, then they'll see what happens if we build, a new line. So in this case, maybe we would build a 300 meg. We'd kind of analyze the effects of building a 300 megawatt line, and then we do a before and after comparison to look at costs. Remember, for this example, we're just focusing on 1 hour. So to do this, we'd need to focus on all hours. So over the course of a year, so 8,760 hours. And then we'd probably need to look at multiple years. So if this is a 20-year, 40-year investment, we'd maybe want to look at least the first 10, 20 years, maybe even the full 40 years. Oops. So congestion cost is a kind of a neutral benchmark for thinking about is new transmission that reduces congestion cost effective. But often the benefits and the costs of reducing congestion are going to depend on market prices and how transmission costs get allocated. So in all of the ISO markets, we have locational marginal pricing. What that means is that when there's transmission congestion and the transmission constraints are binding, that we'll have price separation. So in this example, the market clearing price in zone A, because we still have generation in available generation in zone A. So if we have 1 more megawatt of load in zone A, our marginal cost in zone A is going to be $10 per megawatt hour. So the market clearing price, the locational marginal price in zone A will be $10 a megawatt hour. But in zone B, the market clearing price is going to be $50 a megawatt hour. So we're going to have price separation between the zones. We're also going to have a little bit something weird happening with when we settle everybody, when we figure out who's paying what and who's getting what from the market. So in zone A, we're going to end up with 800 megawatts of generation. But the 800 megawatts of generation is all getting paid this $10 per megawatt hour price, including the 300 megawatts that's getting exported to zone B. And in zone B, all of the loads are going to be paying this $50 per megawatt hour price. What you may be noticing is that there's going to be a kind of a split between what the system operator is taking in terms of payments from loads in zone B and what it's paying out to generators in zone A. And so that's called a congestion rent. In the US, the approach to dealing with these congestion rents is that they go back to paying for financial transmission rights. And a financial transmission right just gives you the ability to earn the difference in prices between two nodes in the transmission system. But you'll kind of start to get the idea that when you think about this in locational marginal pricing terms, it gets a lot more complicated in terms of both who's benefiting from reduced congestion and how you might think about allocating the cost of transmission. Last category I want to talk about, and then we can stop for questions again, is public policy transmission. So kind of quite simply, public policy transmission is transmission that's needed to meet public policy goals. In many cases, public policy transmission is going to be driven by reliability or economic needs. And the idea here is that so in transmission planning, when you're evaluating the need for transmission, you'll include a representation of the transmission system to figure out whether you have any reliability violations, and you'll include your some representation of your generation and a load forecast. And in a lot of cases, the public policy drivers for the generation and the loads will already be included in your transmission planning. And so the effects of that trend, the impacts of those kind of public policy driven resources will already be picked up in reliability and economic transmission planning. But there are some cases where it might not. So for instance, if you're a state that has a renewable portfolio standard and you're realizing, we have this trade-off between building more renewable generation to meet our renewable portfolio standard or building more transmission to be able to deliver that generation and reduce curtailment, that would be an example of public policy transmission. So there's kind of a gray area between public policy transmission and reliability and economic transmission. In general, actually, I have two more things to talk about. In general, most transmission will be driven by reliability, and we'll come back and talk about this in a second. As I mentioned, for reliability transmission, we generally don't do benefit cost analysis, but for economic and public policy transmission, we will. Because transmission has such a long lifetime, so we're talking for average transmission line, probably somewhere between 40 and 60 years, the benefit cost analysis has to have this very long time horizon, usually a minimum of 10 years, but it could be longer, 20 years, maybe even 40 years. On the cost side of the benefit cost analysis, most of the costs of the transmission line are going to be upfront. And then they'll be kind of put into a regulatory process. We'll also talk about this in a second, kind of smoothed out over time. But we do have some operations and maintenance costs that are ongoing. But the benefits of the transmission line will vary quite a bit over the course of time because of changes in loads, changes in generation, changes in the transmission system. So when we try to figure out, is this transmission line going to be cost effective? We have to do a much longer term analysis of benefits. So usually the way that this works is that because the time horizon is very long, it's not cost effective or not practical to do modeling of benefits in each year. Usually transmission providers will kind of pick years to model benefits in. So it might be, if you're doing a 20-year benefit cost analysis, so then like the figure here, you might pick year 5, year 10, year 15, and year 20 to do your benefits analysis. And then to compare with cost, you're going to have to take the net present value of those benefits over the time, whatever time horizon you're using. So in this case, take the net present value or take the present value of benefits over 20 years. You do the same thing with costs. Costs are mostly upfront, but we're going to want to capture O&M costs. So you take the present value of the transmission costs over time, and then you'd compare the present value of the benefits and the present value of the cost in a benefit cost ratio. So for this figure here, we take the present value of these benefits, we get $110 million. Let's say we have $90 million in present value costs. So $110 million divided by $90 million gives you your benefit to cost ratio. It's a 1.23. Raises the question, is this high enough? And it kind of depends. Usually as a kind of matter of regulation, FERC requires transmission providers to use benefit to cost ratios that do not exceed 1.25. So this is probably close, but is it high enough? It kind of depends on the rules. But in general, for trying to figure out is this economic project or public policy project going to be cost effective, there'll be some process like this. We look at the benefits over time, the costs over time, and the benefit to cost ratio, look at some other criteria, and then there'll be a kind of a thumbs up, yes, we're going to build this transmission line, or a thumbs down, no, we're either going to wait or we're going to shelve the project. Wanted to come back to this issue of reliability versus economic transmission. So you probably have this notion, but if you build a lot of transmission to resolve these reliability violations that we talked about before, probably thinking, well, doesn't that also reduce congestion if you're creating new capacity? And the answer is usually yes. So it raises the question, where's the boundary between reliability and economic transmission? Does it matter? In a lot of cases, it will be common for reliability projects to have economic benefits. But again, we don't do benefit cost analysis for reliability projects. It's more common to socialize the cost of reliability projects because the rationale is everybody benefits from reliability. But for economic projects, it's much more intuitive to say, well, whoever benefits from this project should pay. And so this boundary between reliability and economic transmission really matters for cost allocation. As we'll talk about in a second when we get to cost allocation, there's another way to think about planning, which is that we kind of try to capture multiple values when we plan and multiple values during cost allocation. So that's something that's been more in vogue within the last decade. Let me stop and see if there are any questions. Arturo, I'm just going to read your question. So I would assume transmission planning follows the growth and development rates of the cities, communities they supply. How is the timeline for planning and the strategy affected with the adoption of prosumerism with PPAs in those communities? So usually the way that transmission planning will work is that through some process, the transmission planners are going to get load forecasts for each kind of each entity within its planning region. So in a region like MISO, it would be load forecasts from the local utilities. Those load forecasts from the local utilities will include both the growth and development rates of the cities they supply. And so MISO in that process is going to say, based on what we think about, what everybody thinks about the load forecast, are there any needs for new transmission? With prosumerism, when you have changes in loads that are affected by distributed energy resources, you could end up, for instance, if you end up with a lot of solar plus storage that reduces your peak demands, or a lot of energy efficiency that reduces your peak demands, you could end up with lower demand for transmission over the longer term by reducing your needs. But the place where this is going to really kind of the rubber is going to meet the road with this is going to be the load forecast used in transmission planning. Annika.
Yeah, so you mentioned the multi-value planning just a second ago. Could you remind me how Order 1920 addressed multi-value planning? Did they have some sort of like list or something of values that or yeah, types of values that transmission planners were supposed to use, or like a requirement to use a certain number of them? I forget exactly. I thought that Order 1920 addressed multi-value planning, and then I guess my question is how that fits into like the reliability versus economic planning.
Yep, great question. As we'll talk about in a second, the multi-value framework comes from MISO. And so a lot of what's in 1920 was modeled to at least some extent on MISO. The idea, it's very explicit in Order 1920 that transmission providers cannot compartmentalize transmission into reliability, economics, and public policy for the purposes of evaluating benefits. And so in some ways, Order 1920 is requiring transmission providers to think about long-term transmission from this multi-value perspective. How that translates into cost allocation is a little bit different. We'll talk about that in a second. But there is, with 1920, there's definitely a push toward more of a multi-value framework.
Great, thank you. So would you say it sort of replaced the economic versus reliability
Mm,
planning model?
no, it the in 1920, FERC no FERC um, uh, so 1920 is meant to focus on long-term transmission planning. But FERC said, well, we want transmission providers, we want you to develop these long-term transmission planning processes, but at the same time, you can keep the short-term transmission planning processes. And so for the short-term transmission planning processes, so these are kind of like within the next 10 years, this reliability versus economic distinction is still there. What FERC was trying to push in Order 1920 was more of this multi-value perspective and longer term transmission planning. So transmission planning out to a 20-year planning horizon.
Got it. Thank you.
Rich, did you see the question in the chat?
When would the NTA process? Kevin, can you specify what you mean by NTA?
Yeah, I can come off mute. I mean the non-transmission alternative.
Oh, yeah, got it.
So I'm in ISO New England, and
Okay.
there's NTA processes
Yes.
for proposals of flexibility or demand response or something. Is that a FERC order that's or a state state laws that are requiring that NTA process to be undertaken?
Great question. I think it might be. I do not believe that there is a FERC order that requires it, but I could be wrong about that. A lot of transmission providers have them, and especially a lot of the ISOs have them. So it happens in the transmission planning process. So the way that the transmission planning process will work is that you kind of do all of the model, you put in your loads and your generation into your transmission model. You try to figure out whether there's any reliability violations. When we're at the reliability violations part, the transmission provider will start thinking about solutions. One of the solutions as part of that process will typically be NTAs. So would it be cheaper to do, maybe we could add new like something to reduce load in this one particular area, or we could add a new generation in this particular area. So in a lot of cases, it'll be both NTA and maybe consideration for new generation, something besides a transmission line. The advanced transmission alternatives gets all of the kind of newer transmission solutions will also be considered in that phase.
Fritz, I think FERC Order 1000 required NTA consideration, but I don't know if the subsequent orders got rid of that.
I do not know, and I don't know if that's mostly for regional transmission planning or whether that's for local. Yeah, I'm not totally sure. The place where this is a little bit gray is that a lot of states will have their own non-wires requirements on utilities, and so these interact with the ISO processes, and usually in some cases the ISOs will be pretty deferential to how the states are thinking about non-wires alternatives as well.
Got it. Thank you.
All right, let's keep moving. Next section is how transmission gets built. And this is going to be a little bit unsatisfying. We're going to go through this relatively quickly. We've been talking a lot about transmission planning, but there are several other processes through which transmission needs will be identified and transmission will get built. The biggest of these is probably one of the biggest of these is generator interconnection. And the idea with generator interconnection is that when generators go through the interconnection process, they'll be studied for their impacts on the transmission system, including whether they create these reliability violations that will violate NERC standards. And if they do, usually that'll get flagged. Transmission that's needed to resolve those issues will get built, and the cost will be in a lot of cases the cost will be allocated to generators. So a fair amount of transmission build will happen through the generator interconnection process. So for instance, in PJM, that number is around 10% maybe. So it's not trivial. Another process that through which transmission can be built is the transmission planner, the transmission owner kind of own planning processes. In some cases, these will be part of the transmission planning process, as we talked about earlier, but in some cases they'll be separate. So as a transmission owner, even as a transmission owner in the MISO system, you can determine, well, we think, we're trying to access maybe a wind resource that's a little bit remote. We think it'd be cost effective to build new transmission. So we're going to build kind of on our own accord and, paying for it by ourselves. We're going to build new transmission to that region. So transmission owners have a fair amount of latitude in building new transmission. And then the last category of how new transmission gets built is merchant transmission. And merchant means that you don't get regulated cost recovery. So for instance, a transmission line might come in and the transmission owner might say, well, generators in the area, would you be willing to pay me, X amount per year to be a customer on this transmission line? Or, a transmission owner might say, well, there seems to be a lot of congestion in this region. I'm going to build transmission and just earn the difference between locational marginal prices on different sides of the transmission line. This merchant transmission is much less common, but it is another avenue through which transmission gets built. The main avenue of all of these four, the main avenue in which transmission is getting built is these transmission planning processes. In the ISO regions, it'll be the ISO transmission planning process. In the non-ISO regions, it'll typically be the utility transmission planning processes. There's not a lot of transmission that gets built in the West and the Southeast in these regional transmission planning processes. In fact, almost none. In thinking about how transmission gets built, it's important to keep in mind that transmission is very much interactive with resource planning. So the two key components in transmission plans, the three key components are some representation of your transmission system, loads, load forecasts, and resources. Given that the fact that for most of the US, that load and resources part is at least planned for in either integrated resource plans or some form of a resource plan, you get the sense that the kind of resource planning side of this is at least indirectly very interactive with the transmission planning side of this. In some cases, those interactions are more explicit. So for instance, in MISO, the load forecasts that are used in transmission planning will come from the utility load forecasting process, which are also kind of intertwined with their resource planning processes. Order 1920 requires transmission providers to at least consider the integrated resource plans in their long-term transmission plans. So that's more of an example of a direct link between integrated resource plans and transmission plans. You'll have all of these other interactions as well that I'm not going to go into, but just keep in mind that there's on the resource side of this through resource planning and on the transmission side of this through transmission planning, there's a lot of interactions. These interactions are a lot more complicated because of the way that open access regulations split up the transmission system and generation in the 1990s, but those interactions are still there. And there's a lot more interest in kind of how to improve coordination between these two things. There has been a lot more interest in the last decade or so. Let me go through cost allocation real quick, and then we can finish with questions. So we've talked about how transmission gets built, planned and built. We've talked about how transmission gets planned and built, but often the sticking point for transmission will be who pays for it. So for instance, two examples. So say that we build a high voltage transmission line within Minnesota. Should the rest of MISO pay for that transmission line? Under what conditions? Should generators pay for some of the cost of that line? Also, under what conditions? Or say that we build a transmission line between Indiana and Ohio. Indiana and Ohio kind of crosses between MISO territory and PJM territory. So in that case, should in both Indiana and Ohio customers pay for it? Should only MISO customers pay for it? Under what circumstances? If we're building high voltage transmission in MISO, should customers in SPP, transmission customers in SPP pay for some of that? Also on what basis and under what conditions? As you'll see in a second, a lot of these questions have really complicated answers that vary a lot by transmission provider. And the way, or I guess let me say this, the way that cost allocation works varies a lot by transmission provider. Okay. Before we start talking about cost allocation, we have to start by talking about transmission costs. So in a lot of cases, you'll hear people saying things like, well, you know, this transmission line is going to cost $200 million or $5 billion. How are we going to allocate the cost of that $200 million or that $5 billion? But in reality, what's getting allocated in a lot of cases is something called the annual transmission revenue requirement, or the ATRR. And the difference you can kind of see in this figure here, the investment costs of the transmission facility are going to be maybe the first 5 years where you're actually building it, include the siting, permitting, equipment, construction costs. But once it's built, we're going to take all of those costs and we're going to convert them into annual depreciation costs and annual return. We're going to include operations and maintenance costs, and then we're going to include taxes on top of that. So in a lot of cases, these annual costs will be lower in most cases than the upfront investment cost of the line, but they'll be over a much longer time horizon. So in most cases, what we're going to be allocating is this annual transmission revenue requirement and not the investment cost. So it adds kind of this really important time horizon to the cost allocation question. When you think about cost allocation, there's three main considerations: location, voltage, and drivers. Location is the project solely located in a transmission owner's zone, or between transmission owners, or within a transmission zone? Voltage is going to be, is it lower or higher voltage? And then drivers are going to be the three drivers that we talked about. Is it a reliability project, economic project, or a public policy project? For local, it's more likely that a project's cost will be allocated locally if a project is solely within a transmission owner's service territory. But as you'll see in a second, not always. Higher voltage projects tend to be more important for regional reliability, and so in a lot of cases, those will be allocated regionally, but again, not always. And then drivers for reliability projects we also tend to think, rural reliability is a regional thing, so we're going to allocate those regionally. Economics, as we talked about before, more likely to think, well, beneficiaries should pay for those. Same with public policy. So drivers also are a really important consideration in cost allocation. As we'll see in a second, how these play out in different regions varies quite a bit, but these are really useful to keep these considerations are really useful to keep in your mind as we're going through. The basic cost allocation framework, highest level question is, how of that annual transmission revenue requirement, how much are we going to allocate to generators and how much to loads? The rationale for allocating to some transmission cost to generators is that if we don't allocate any cost to transmission generators and we give no signal to generators on transmission costs, then they could just site wherever. We don't give them any incentive to site in parts of the transmission system that have excess capacity where they're not going to trigger incremental costs. The way that this is played out in the US is that in the transmission planning process, usually most of the generators that are considered in that process will already have interconnection agreements. And that a lot of that incremental transmission need, so if a generator connects and it causes system impacts that need to be resolved through transmission, a lot of that's happening in interconnection where the costs are getting allocated to generators. So typically the way that this highest level allocation of generators versus load costs has worked out is that the transmission costs that are triggered in transmission planning will get picked up by loads, and the transmission costs that are triggered in generator interconnection will mostly get picked up by generators. Within the loads, we have this question of, well, how much of the costs do we allocate locally, and how much of the costs do we allocate regionally? When you think about the allocation of costs, you also have to think about different levels. So especially in an RTO, within an RTO, we'll have different zones. Within a zone, we might have one or more transmission owners, and then each of the transmission owners is going to have a bunch of retail customers. So in general, RTOs will be responsible for the cost allocation down to kind of this point, down to the transmission owners. The allocation down to transmission customers is more transmission owner territory, but FERC is responsible for those. MISO gives a really nice illustration of how complicated these different levels of cost allocation can be. So again, MISO has this very large system in the middle of the US. It has different subregions. So this is an example of the MISO South subregion, but all there will be 4 subregions in the MISO area. Within the total MISO region, there'll be different cost allocation zones. So there are 12 cost allocation zones. So these are the kind of the first level zone at which transmission costs will be allocated. And then within each cost allocation zone, you'll have pricing zones that will generally match up to transmission owners. So in MISO, you have these 4 levels of cost allocation. You can kind of see how this gets complicated relatively quickly. Broadly, the way that this has worked, though, across transmission providers is that costs have been allocated according to, at least in the short-term transmission planning processes, that they've been allocated to driver. So for reliability transmission, costs get allocated either locally or regionally for higher voltage transmission. For economic transmission, costs will be typically allocated based on benefits, and then public policy will often be integrated into reliability and economic transmission. The way that this kind of plays out in different regions is very much region specific. So I wanted to walk through a couple quick examples to show you how this is different, how cost allocation is different in different ISOs. First, let's work from the back of this, the simplest example, and work forward. So as I mentioned earlier in the presentation, CalISO is the definition of regional transmission in CalISO is any transmission that's planned and operated by the California ISO, and that includes anything that's sort of in the higher voltage range. So anything above at or above 200 kV. Any transmission that's in that category will be allocated. The cost of any transmission that's in that category will get allocated to loads 100% based on the loads, on the share of loads. In California, which is kind of unique to California, these are going to be based on the share of energy. So if you're a transmission owner that has, I'm just going to make up a number, 100 megawatt hours of load in some year, and the total system had 1,000 megawatt hours of load in some year, you would get allocated 10% of the cost. This approach is extremely, extremely simple. And part of the reason that it's workable is because California is a single state ISO. As you'll see in a second with MISO and PJM, their cost allocation approaches are much more complicated. So for PJM, there's two kind of delineations of transmission type. We've got regional transmission, which is any transmission that is double circuit. That'll mean kind of you can see that the 2 circuits on the transmission lines usually, and it has to be at or above 345 kV. Lower voltage for PJM will be anything that's above 200 kV and less than 345 kV. So for regional projects, regional reliability projects, so meeting that regional definition and a reliability driver, 50% of the cost is going to be allocated according to loads, this time not on the basis of energy, but on the basis of peak load. And 50% is going to be allocated based on these things called distribution factors. These are power flows. So half the costs are going to be allocated kind of on a more simpler metric that's region-wide, and half of the costs are going to be based on use of the transmission system, flows on the transmission system. For lower voltage transmission, it's all about flows of the transmission system. So if your loads are causing higher use of the transmission system, you'll end up paying more for transmission. For economic transmission projects, half the cost for regional projects, half the costs get allocated based on your share of load, and half the costs are going to be based on payments by load. So you can think about this as the reduced congestion cost of different loads. For lower voltage projects, it's going to be 100% for decreased net load payments, so lower congestion costs to loads. PJM also has this state agreement approach that allows states to propose and pay for transmission. For those projects, 100% gets allocated to the sponsoring state or states. And then PJM has this very seldom used multi-driver that's where the cost will be allocated proportional to benefits. Cost allocation in MISO is very different from PJM. So MISO, the idea is you start from the local transmission owners, and most of the reliability projects will be allocated to local transmission owners. If reliability projects meet certain criteria, so if they're above 200 kV, if they have a cost of above $5 million, and if they have a cost benefit ratio of 1.25 or higher, they'll be considered market efficiency projects, and they'll be allocated to the region. So again, most projects are going to be reliability projects and allocated to transmission owners. There's a few projects that will meet these market efficiency criteria that will get allocated to the region. The way that MISO approached this, how do we allocate regional costs, was through having this multi-value project planning process. And so this is over time. MISO started this in the 2000s or sometime in the mid 2000s. And over time, this merged into something called the long-range transmission planning process. And in this process, MISO is thinking about transmission needs more from this multi-value perspective. So, if projects meet reliability, economic, and public policy needs, and do they meet certain cost-benefit criteria? And if so, we're going to build them. But what's unique about MISO is that the cost allocation for these projects is on the basis of load. So MISO didn't try to figure out, okay, who's benefiting from these projects, and we're going to allocate the costs according to benefits. Instead, MISO is allocating costs according to load, a load ratio share. And the load ratio share in this case, like California, is $1 per megawatt hour basis. So in a lot of ways, you can kind of think about the multi-value projects as being socialized across all of MISO customers. The thing I want to take away from this example is that CalISO has this really, really simple approach that's great, but it's harder to do in these multi-state ISOs because you're having to allocate more costs across states. So PJM's approach, this resulted from a lot of this resulted from court decisions. It's something that over time a lot of the states in PJM became comfortable with. It's much harder in PJM, I would say, to have regional allocation where you're just going to say transmission is benefiting everyone, so we're going to allocate the cost regionally. Whereas in MISO, because a lot of the multi-value project process was driven by states originally, it's been easier to have this regional allocation of costs for at least for those multi-value projects. But as sort of a balance to that, a lot of the other transmission MISO is allocated. The costs of that transmission are allocated locally. So there's every transmission provider in the US has kind of found this balance in cost allocation a little bit differently. Let me stop there and see if there are any questions on the rest. I'll give a quick couple of thoughts to wrap up, but let's just stop for questions for the time being. And I've also lost my chat, so I can't see if there's any questions in the chat.
I don't see any questions in the chat, but folks can enter that or raise their hand. I had a question.
Yeah.
You talked about ownership and planning and cost allocation, but you didn't really talk about financing. And some of this is pretty complicated. So if it's local transmission, especially if it's within one state, it's the utility. And there are state ways to address like a multi-state utility like PacifiCorp. But how does it work when it's across different state lines?
How do you mean the financing part?
The financing, right?
So most of
if it's an independent transmission owner or if it's like a utility that's going across state lines, different cases.
So once the transmission revenue requirement has been approved, and once the costs are on the utility's books, or even before that, the utility will use the same approach to financing regional transmission that it uses for local transmission. So a lot of this will be corporate finance.
Well, what about the upfront costs? How does that get financed and then recouped later?
that gets financed and recouped later through rates.
Through FERC approved rates, if it's
Yes.
okay. Thanks.
For transmission that is not built by utilities, the financing will be a lot more innovative. But for utilities, it's sort of bread and butter.
Right. Okay. But ultimately, through FERC approved rates, independent transmission developer will recoup its costs theoretically.
Yes.
Has an opportunity to do so. All right. Any questions anybody's thought of? So I have at least one more question. I wanted to hear your thoughts on ways that states can most effectively work together to get transmission built, given that, it's state by state siting. It's so challenging. And then you mentioned also the thorny cost allocation issues.
The siting, so there's a lot of complications to this, to the how do you get the cooperation to get transmission built question. I think for siting, there is still a tendency among some states to kind of look at this from a what's in it for me perspective, which in fairness makes sense. But it is still the case that that some states will say, I don't see any benefits of this line, so I'm not going to cite this line. I think in the context of an ISO planning process, it's much easier to be transparent about here's what we're going to be doing in terms of transmission expansion for the regional system, and for different states to be able to see how they benefit from that. And so in theory, the ISO regional transmission planning process provides at least some fodder for states to be able to say, yes, we're going to collaborate because we can see where the benefits are in these transmission lines. I think the best example of these processes of state cooperation around transmission are the ones that led to MISO's multi-value project planning process. So this was an initiative by a bunch of states in the upper Midwest to build transmission into connect wind and to in general to kind of expand out their transmission systems. And because this was a bottom-out process, it was much easier, and it was sort of facilitated at the governor's level. It was much easier to get the political consensus for everybody to get on board than I think it would be if you were to just have, in the independent transmission developer case where you're trying to route a transmission line through multiple states, and they're kind of all of the states are looking at you and saying, well, how am I going to benefit from this? Why are you, what's in it for me?
Great, thanks. I don't see any other questions or hands up. So maybe go through your concluding remarks and then we'll wrap.
Sure. The couple things I want you to take away from this. Transmission is one of these topics that is multi-level. It's really complicated. Every time you learn something, you learn about the exceptions. It's just really hard to kind of feel like you have a grasp of it. There's some good resources to look through on transmission, but one of the best resources is to look through old FERC orders and to try to figure, especially the conversation, and to try to figure out, okay, here's what FERC is trying to do. Here's what transmission owners in the states are trying to do, and it just gives you a better sense of the kind of the political economy of how this process works in the U.S. On the kind of more physical side, there's some good resources if there's interest. I think my email's at the end of this. There's some good resources. My email, let me try this again. Just email if you're interested in this topic and wanting to learn more. Just email me and I'll try to find resources that are kind of matched up with what you're looking for. There's also a lot of interest apparently. Just based on a presentation I gave last week in the congestion piece of this and how the economics of congestion works. So again, if there's interest in that, just email me and I'd be happy to provide resources. Lisa, I'll turn it back to you.
I think that's a wrap. Thanks everyone. Thanks so much, Fritz. It was a great presentation.
Thank you all.